Hey everyone, this is a chapter from uh, Christoph Jünke's uh, book on Leo Kofler. Um, in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union, um, in one of the chapters, there is there's a subheading about Kofler, and I'd like to get more of a feel for what his critiques or of the social system that was either forming or formed in the Soviet Union. And I knew nothing about Kofler. I've never read anything by Christoph Jünke. Just wanted to read this chapter to get a feel for some of the commentaries that were contemporary with people that I know more about and have, at least until now, more interest in, such as Castoriadis, and other people operating in the 40s and 50s. But I'm not sure when Kofler wrote his theses, but in the chapter, it's in the same period, 1940. In the Western Marxism in the Soviet Union book, it's from in the same chapter as Castoriadis and other people, 1941 to 1956. So, yeah, other people that are in there are Fritz Sternberg, Saikon, I don't know their first name, Paul Fulik, and Leo Kofler, who I'm reading now. So, yeah. Anyway, just wanted to get a feel for some of the secondary literature on the mid 20th century commentaries from the radical left on the USSR and Stalinism. Anyway, the political spring of 1967 to 68 was not only a time of lasting politicization, not only a time in which the incursion of subaltern strata and classes in everyday political and social life moved the social balance of power globally to the left. An integral part of this process was also the sharpening of theoretical wits. For those who want more than merely to flee the earthly vale of tears of the here and now, those who want to set off for new shores, who want to know from where the journey starts. The question of Stalinism at that time stirred the passions, since it weighed like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Not only that, since it was more than just a question of history, as the violent suppression of the Czechoslovakian, quote, socialism with a human face, end quote, in the autumn of 1968 made painfully clear. In this time of a tumultuous expansion and politicization of necessities, the demand for reading material was immense. Many authors critical of society who until then had been leading a ghettoized social life now became much sought after authors with mass appeal. Leo Kofler also, quote, profited, end quote, from this. The pioneer of a non-dogmatic post-war Marxism suppressed from all sides, who in the German-speaking world was only comparable in diversity of topics and radicalism of content to Adorno, to whom, however, he was far superior in the courage of his socialist convictions. In any case, the anti-authoritarian revolt and its need for a theory allowed Kofler to reissue one or two of his old writings. The one that is to be discussed here is his 1970 publication, Stalinismus und Bürokratie, Stalinism and Bureaucracy, in which Kofler published two of his old essays critical of Stalinism, already published in 1952, together with new material. Kofler's old analyses of Stalinism were of particular significance. because they marked the first systematic attempt in the German-speaking world after the Second World War to criticize Stalinist theory with Marxist means, and this at a level that many of the later, similarly grouped works of other authors barely approach. Even if Kofler's critique of Stalinism trod on historical new ground at the beginning of the 1950s, it was also deeply rooted in that socialist classical period of which Kofler was also a child. A. Laying the cornerstone. Kofler was a child of Austro-Marxism, a particular variant of international social democracy between the world wars, which was decidedly radical and Marxist in orientation compared to the European social democracy of the time. Kofler stood on its left wing and was strongly influenced by Max Adler, perhaps the most important representative of left socialism at the time, who saw himself as an alternative to both Leninist communism and social democratic revisionism. The young Kofler accordingly criticized his party from the left at the beginning of the 1930s, like most of the Austro-Marxist left at the time, wished for a stronger orientation by social democracy to the Bolshevik model of Soviet Russia. This closeness to the Soviet Union, however, never went so far that Kofler or the other Austro-Marxists became blind apologists for the Soviet system. The criticisms of the Stalinist terror of the 1930s was widespread in the Austrian workers' movement and a matter of principle. Kofler also shared this approach. In spite of all the sympathy for Moscow, he was never uncritical and massively doubted, for example, the legitimacy of the Moscow show trials during his Swiss emigration at the end of the 1930s. This tension between political closeness and intellectual distance was also reflected in Kofler's first work, Die Wissenschaft von der Gesellschaft, written during his Swiss emigration and published there in 1944. There's no translation here, but I believe that's Die Wissenschaft von der Gesellschaft is the science of society. I'm not sure, though. In the last pages of this, quote, methodology of dialectical sociology, end quote, so runs the subtitle, dedicated to practice, Kofler detected in the, quote, carriers of the correct consciousness, end quote, i.e. amongst contemporary Marxists and communists, a, quote, propensity to bureaucratism, end quote, that originate in the fact that, quote, the reification structure of the environment still perpetually projects into the thought of individuals who are already in general standing on the ground of correct consciousness, end quote. Bureaucratism here is thus conceived of as, quote, that form of retreat behind the actual awareness of that sociologically has its cause in the not overcome influence of the environment on the carrier of the correct consciousness, and therefore appears ideologically as the rigid mediation of knowledge and knowledge's application, end quote. If Kofler explicitly dissociates himself in the last paragraphs of his book from the, quote, tendency of a fundamental opposition, end quote, and from, quote, destructive criticism of bureaucratism, end quote, Kofler adopts the position of the reform communist Georg Lukács and implicitly distances himself from the left communist, i.e., most notably the Trotskyist critique of Stalin. This means that Kofler, in the tradition of the, quote, integral socialism, end quote, of Otto Bauer, demands a, quote, self-criticism, end quote, of the socialist Marxist movement, which he consciously places in quotation marks, since he obviously claims such a self-criticism not in the Stalinist sense, but against the same. In typical reform communist manner, Kofler also laments, quote, vulgar mechanistic thinking, end quote, and its, quote, smart Alex, end quote, that is to say, the socialist bureaucracy. In his second work, Zur Geschichte der bürgerlichen Gesellschaft, which I believe translates to the history of civil society, or bourgeois society. Anyway, published in 1948 in the not yet GDR. Kofler emphasizes that he agrees with both Stalin and Lukács on this, but implicitly questions Stalinist propaganda concerning the socialist character of the USSR when he points out, among other things, that due to the conditions of primitive accumulation, quote, a certain restriction in the consumption of consumer goods is inevitable, end quote. He reacted to the fact that the SED, guardians of pure doctrine at the time, the quote, intellectual bureaucracy, end quote, the quote, Inquisition, end quote, as Kofler will soon say, make precisely such references, the reason for his own condemnation. With a detailed theoretical critique in 1950 of Marxist bureaucratic mechanism in the fundamental work Geschichte und Dialektik, which I think is History and Dialectic. I'm not sure. Which was written while still in the GDR but only published in the West in 1955. Here, in continuation of the Die Wissenschaft der Gesellschaft, the science of society, he calls the, quote, mechanistic vulgar sociology, end quote, a tumor within Marxism, a product of the failure to overcome being mired in bourgeois reification. Quote, the conscious or unconscious notion in the vulgar Marxist conception that history follows economic legalism without ideology, which has grown up out of the soil of economic being, playing an essential role here, tears up the historical process in the exact same way as the old materialism, which had humans clutching the apron strings of, quote, nature, end quote, geography and climate. Here as there, man remains ultimately at base only a passive appendage of a law external to him. Here as there, the dialectical relationship between activity and passivity is alien to thought, end quote. Kofler. With the loss of the dialectic, Marxist bureaucratism also lost the horizon of individual and social practice. For without the Marxist subject-object theory, only a flat, historically determinist materialism remained. As open and unmistakable as this methodological critique of Stalinist bureaucratism is on the theoretical level, Kofler gave no account up to this point of the historical conditions and continuous forms for the implementation of Stalinist theory and practice. Only when he finally had to give up the hope of being tolerated as a reformer within, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, only after his flight to West Germany at the end of 1950 did he also reflect on this side of the Stalinist complex. In both the years 1950 and 1952, Kofler wrote 5 small pamphlets on Stalinist theory and practice. The first, a treatise on the Stalinization of East German universities, was highly personal and not published. In the second, Marxistischer oder Stalinistischer Marxismus, eine Betrachtung über die Verfälschung der marxistischen Lehre durch die stalinistische Bürokratie. Marxist or Stalinist Marxism. An observation on the falsification of Marxist teachings by the Stalinist bureaucracy. I couldn't have translated that. That's in the text. Published in Cologne in 1951, Kofler places Marxist and Stalinist Marxism against each other with pointed political emphasis. In the third, der Fall Lukács, Georg Lukács und der Stalinism, the Lukács case, Georg Lukács and Stalinism, published in Cologne in 1952. Kofler defends Georg Lukács, and in the fourth, the essence and the role of the Stalinist bureaucracy, published in 1952, he takes up the second pamphlet in a more sober and comprehensive manner. In the fifth and last, Marxism and Language, regarding Stalin's investigation, Marxism and Problems of Linguistics, Cologne 1952, he deepens his critique with reference to Stalin's influential work on linguistics. The last two essays are those that he eventually collected in his book Stalinismus und Bürokratie, published in 1970 by Luchterhand. B. Expansion. Kofler's critique of Stalinism, worked out in the early 1950s, differs substantially from both of the two predominant explanatory models for historical Stalinism. Kofler rejects the bourgeois critique that first and foremost attributes Stalinism to Marxist theory in the same fashion as he rejects those allegedly leftist theories that attribute Stalinism to crimes, cult of personality, and excesses in order to maintain a, quote, socialist, end quote, kernel of the same. Against both, he argues that Stalinist practice was no product of Marxist theory. Rather, it was their, quote, Marxist, end quote, theory that was the product of a blinkered bureaucratic practice, the product of a, quote, narrow and mindless practicality, end quote, of a bureaucratic stratum that sought to defend their privileges. Stalinism, for Kofler, is no historically inevitable phenomenon. Stalinism is rooted far more in specific historical conditions of social backwardness. Stalinism could, however, successfully spread because Stalinism provided an answer to objective problems of each and every transitional society from capitalism to socialism. The specifically Stalinist answer to the general transition problem was, however, a deeply inhuman anti-humanist one and had set back the socialist movement for at least several decades. The political aim appearing here in his radical anti-Stalinist critique is that of democratic socialism. It will, quote, prove that every genuine socialism must be fundamentally democratic, or so it won't be at all, end quote. Kofler. 1. Critique of bureaucracy. At the center of Kofler's typical left socialist critique of Stalinism is the role of the bureaucracy as a ruling stratum. Kofler's theoretical point of departure is a fundamental critique of the same. For Kofler, Marxism was always an inherently anti-bureaucratic, as bureaucracy is always a sign of the formalism of bourgeois conceptions of equality. Bureaucracy could only exist where the measuring stick of formal equality of individuals was applied. Historically, the bureaucracy may have been indispensable, even progressive and revolutionary, primarily in the early bourgeois period, when the liberation of the individual was at stake. However, it was also always a fundamental evil. While the bureaucratic habitus fundamentally expressed, quote, indifference and unfamiliarity towards life, end quote, and was inclined to encroach on all social spheres and subjugate individuals and their thought, socialism was per se a break from this essentially formal bourgeois equality based on market and commodity relations. In principle, bureaucracy was therefore also surmountable. First, through a rationalization and simplification of administration, and, second, through its democratization. Such a democratization would be made possible above all through education and cultivation for the purpose of taking over bureaucratic work. Quote, the democratization of bureaucratism turns at a certain height and breadth into bureaucratism's abolition, end quote. Alphabon. End quote. Since Kofler shares the Marxist theory of a necessary transitional society, for a critique of the concept of a transitional society, listen to the audiobook I put up by Adam Buick, and also the works by Paresh Chattopadhyay that I've put up on the channel. Since Kofler shares the Marxist theory of a necessary transitional society in which new relations of production are still coupled with old maxims of distribution, he considers the bureaucracy in the phase of historical transition to be unavoidable. He does not see in this assessment any justification of the Stalinist bureaucracy. To be sure, every transition to socialism has to struggle with bourgeois and bureaucratic habits and mentalities, but the concrete point of departure for the question of bureaucracy in Soviet Russia was the specifically Russian conditions. First, the lack of consumer goods conditioned by industrial underdevelopment, which made a, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote, necessary. Second, the missing democratic tradition and the depletion of democratic forces during the Russian Civil War. Third, quote, the additional entrusting to the bureaucracy of the direction and supervision of the economy, end quote. For Kofler, the mixture of the Tsarist legacy and the post-revolutionary planned economy is therefore causally responsible for the degeneration of the structures, and not the planned economy as such, which is possible in democratic as well as non-democratic forms. Under democratic conditions, Kofler writes, the formalistic technicism of the plan was only a normal problem of arithmetic. Quote, without the direct participation of the democratic forces of the people in the government and without direct democratic control through the people, every planned economy must bureaucratically degenerate. With the presence of these forces and such a control, the planned economy cannot bureaucratically degenerate, end quote. With regards to the practical means for a democratic demarcation against post-revolutionary bureaucratism, Kofler refers to Lenin's remarks in State and Revolution, advocates for bureaucrats to be subject to recall at any time, to have a worker's wage, a constant changing of function, cultivation of workers for administrative work, amongst other things, and considers the retention of a free market compatible with the democratic self-administration of the shop floor. Against this theoretical backdrop, Soviet Russian bureaucracy is for him a historical phenomenon of degeneration in which there was explicitly no inherent historical necessity, and therefore, quote, sooner or later it will be overcome, end quote. There is, for Kofler, no excuse, quote, for the Stalinist degeneration of Russian socialism, since the degeneration of bureaucratism in Russia into an utterly terroristic dictatorship was avoidable, and second, it was thoroughly possible to gradually dismantle this instead of increasing it, end quote. This incremental dismantling was and is possible as, quote, all observations teach us that the masses of the East will not voluntarily agree to any restoration of capitalist private enterprise. They want to take their fate in their own hands on a democratic basis. They want socialism, end quote. To this end, quote, a reasonable and sympathetic leadership and education of the people, end quote, is needed so that the development, quote, in regards to economy and culture can take place on liberatory grounds, end quote. In summary, Kofler sees the dynamic element in the socio-economic relations of Soviet Russia, because with material development, the material basis of the bureaucracy waned. The solidifying ideological relations are, for Kofler, in contrast, the static inhibiting element of a de-Stalinization that was essentially anti-bureaucratic. 2. Critique of bureaucratic ideology. The bureaucratization and dehumanization organically connected with it, and in this Kofler is in agreement with all contemporary Marxist critiques of Stalinism, is the product of the interest of the bureaucracy as a social stratum which, quote, essentially revolves around the fear of a possible democratic resistance and the defense of the privileges of the bureaucracy, end quote. At the same time, Kofler shifts and presents his own main points in the contemporary context against a reduction of the problem to bureaucratic privileges. Quote, from, quote, interest, end quote, alone, it is, for example, impossible to understand the specifically vulgar Marxist and mechanistic mode of thought in Stalinism, end quote, he writes. Whoever thinks too much in categories of bureaucratic conspiracy will find no explanation of the subjectively honest mental state, Befindlichkeit, of Stalinists. The mode of thought and being of the socialist bureaucracy would be torn asunder, and their strength in regards to intellectual hegemony, to use a newer term, thus not understood. The bureaucratic ideology, Kofler insists on this, was not merely pure cynicism, but rather an objective self-delusion, namely ideology. Kofler correctly sees his originality and his main merit less in the historical analysis of Stalinism and more in its ideological critique. Stalinism solidified itself as a bureaucratic ideology, distorting and falsifying Marxist theory not only beyond recognition but also to the point of leading an independent existence. It was therefore pertinent to theoretically confront this falsification that had taken on a life of its own and to work out Marxism anew as something anti-dogmatic and liberatory. A de-dogmatization of such a kind brought about through Enlightenment and critique. De-dogmatization is understood here in opposition to the bourgeois critique of dogmatism as an explicit return to Marxist sources. Is for Kofler a decisive means for the debureaucratization of the socialist movement and thereby also a piece of political practice. What historical critique is for an Isaac Deutscher, critique of Marxist theory is for Leo Kofler. I missed a footnote. But anyway, for a stimulating overview, besides that offered by Linden, who I've mentioned already, Marcel van der Linden, see Alberg, 1976. Kofler does not join the discussion then taking place about whether this bureaucracy involved a new class or merely a new stratum, but it is clear that Kofler inclines to those who understand the bureaucracy not as a new class but as a stratum. End footnote. Kofler identifies three characteristic forms of Stalinist distortion of Marxism. First, Stalinist thought eliminated the dialectic from Marxism. Second, Stalinist thought reduced historical materialism to a flat mechanistic economism. Finally, Stalinism, quote, forgot, end quote, Marxist humanism, which seeks to free man from every form of alienation. All three distortions are neither coincidental nor marginal. Those distortions concern Marxism as a whole, concern those three core elements of Marxism that Kofler considers fundamental. For Kofler, Marxist theory is essentially based on three pillars. In that the limits of consciousness are nowhere exceeded, the Marxist search for the historical laws of motion stood in contrast to the natural scientific concept of law, and could only be grasped as a dialectic of subject and object, as thought in totality. It is the subject-object dialectic, mediated by human consciousness, that made Marxism a philosophy of practice. If this dialectic is removed, as became clear in the Stalinist condemnation of the Hegelian dialectic, one thwarted the recognition of the social and practical side of Marxism and fell back into a, quote, stupid, end quote, materialism based on the methodology of natural science. This persistence in bourgeois reifications was promoted through the new, mechanistically misunderstood methods of economic planning, and solidified itself into a bureaucratic formalism, which was compelled to violate humans in their real existence. Quote, the quote, egalitarian end quote, formalism, which is therefore hostile to quality, not only blindly passes by the distinctness and variety of individual abilities, needs, and fateful experiences, in the condition of this contempt for the human and qualitative, it is also incapable of grasping the complicated social process, whose essence exists in the social relationality between the individual and the universal, the subjective and the objective, and in the constant changing of the one into the other. Only seeing through the character of reality as essentially being dialectical totality makes practice possible as a form of a fully consciously aware action resting on a correct knowledge of the elements of real events. Where this cognitive condition is not fulfilled, there thought clings to itself and activity in its own jurisdiction determined by it, so that it rationalizes in an extreme fashion with respect to the entire social world, as it is sinking at the same time into an abstruse irrationalism of either mechanistic or metaphysical character, end quote. Bureaucratic thought fell prey in this way to specialism and fetishism of facts, to positivism and vulgar materialism, sharing the bourgeois materialist misunderstanding of Marxism. As in bourgeois thought, such a mechanism was supplemented by a voluntarism that is in principle unbridled and unmediated. Subject and object fell apart just like objectivism and subjectivism. If Stalinism in socio-political practice is primarily subjectivist and voluntaristic, in theory, Stalinism is primarily objectivism. Naturally and mechanistically passive, quote, biased to vulgar Marxism, end quote, sensualistically blind, end quote. In short, it is, quote, the most visible and at the same time most extreme exponent of un-Marxist Marxism in our time, end quote. Kofler repeatedly illustrates this with two important examples, Stalinist historiography and its theory of aesthetics. Due to the flattening of historical materialism into vulgar economism, Stalinist historiography is capable of achieving little more than an elaboration of sources and the compilation of an external body of facts. They hunted in a purely outward fashion for the economic factor in history, but did not advance to a, quote, interpretive understanding of history, end quote. An organic integration of the struggles in the history of ideas. Thus they continue to cling to the bourgeois overestimation of the study of source material, to, quote, flat empiricism, end quote, i.e. to a, quote, descriptive representation of history, end quote, without advancing to that, quote, narrative representation of history, end quote, that one could occasionally admire in isolated bourgeois historians, mostly coming out of idealism. Since the stupid flat materialism did not understand the dialectic of the individual and universal, that stupid flat materialism was also incapable of understanding art, which is essentially concerned with the totality of the individual. Because, quote, the bureaucratic consciousness is not capable of truly grasping the individual and the individual's problems, the bureaucratic consciousness imputes a mental and psychological development to the individual that conforms in a stereotypical fashion to a preconceived outlook, end quote. This led ultimately to flattening, distortion, depletion, and stereotyping. The form of socialist realism thoroughly defended by Kofler became reduced in Stalinism to a naturalistic and positivistic, quote, romantic realism, end quote, to a sensualistic theory of reflection. that degraded the active individual into a passive object. This peculiar mixture of the flattened naturalism and idealizing romanticism ultimately condensed into the inability to sensibly divide the worldview of the artist and his artistic product. Incapable in this manner of understanding practice and individuality in history and the present. Stalinism also found no access to the understanding of Marx's revolutionary humanism. Quote, Stalinism changes the individual in his traditional one-sidedness, imperfection, misery, and inner strife, only insofar as Stalinism must restlessly subjugate the individual to Stalinism's bureaucratic needs. Stalinism gives the individual education, insofar as Stalinism needs, quote, intellectuals, end quote. Stalinism gives him idealism, insofar as Stalinism needs this idealism in service of the, quote, fatherland, end quote, construction, end quote. Stalinism makes the individual familiar with the theories of Marx, insofar as the individual needs these theories to be a blindly credulous servant of the state. But Stalinism leaves the individual unchanged at the core, so that the individual can do all this. End quote. On the one hand, one emphasized in recourse to Marxism a fundamental historical optimism. On the other hand, one pessimistically accepted man, quote, in his so-being, end quote. The specifically Stalinist ethic was accordingly also a markedly contradictory mixture of, quote, exaggerated morality and abysmal immorality, end quote, that found its cause in the typical Stalinist inclination to, quote, impinge educationally on man via disciplinary intent, end quote. Thus, the mental elite of Stalinism, the, quote, mental bureaucracy, end quote, acquired the character of, quote, Stalinism's Inquisition, end quote. Kofler's ideological critique of the Stalinist bureaucracy proves itself here to be a typical exemplar of the philosophy of praxis, a critique of Stalinism situated in the context of, quote, Western Marxism, end quote. Western Marxism as a philosophical current, however, took no unified political conclusions from its approach. Correspondingly, Kofler also emphasizes his own accents here. Perspectives of debureaucratization. It is a feature of Kofler's approach that he attributes a revolutionizing role to ideology and consciousness, and once it is enlightened and de-dogmatized, because the social antagonism in the East was fundamentally different than the social antagonism in the West, because the dominant bureaucracy in the East was, quote, not capitalist, but rather an exponent of transformed, namely at least formally, socialist relations, end quote. The dominant bureaucracy could not, quote, divest itself of that consciousness of socialist responsibility that flows from the commitment to the socialist humanism of Marxism, end quote. The unveiling of Stalinist thought is therefore, for Kofler, an eminently practical act. With his dialectic of norm and reality, he aligns himself with the reform communist position that sees its hope in de-Stalinization and anti-bureaucratic democratization, primarily in a transformation of the political superstructure. After all, according to Kofler at the time, the Yugoslav party leader Tito had shown, quote, that with a correct leadership and education of the masses, the same result can be achieved without forcing things and terror, end quote. In this sense, Kofler would side with all reform communist aspirations in the Eastern Bloc, from Tito to Dubček. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. Dubček being the, I believe, I might be wrong, but I believe was the, I guess one of the main figures of socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia. However, the case was different with the USSR. The Soviet-Russian bureaucracy, Kofler assessed in 1952, quote, defends the interest of accumulation against the interest of the masses, whereby it shies away from no means to defend this against them, along with their uninterruptedly increasing power to subjugate ever more domains, including the cultural and intellectual, end quote. Thus, historical Stalinism until the middle of the 1930s, i.e. until the outbreak of the Great Terror, was, quote, from the historian's, exclamation point of view, perhaps, exclamation point, still bearable, end quote. Quote, but in the meanwhile, the completed, exclamation point, bureaucratization of the whole social life of the Soviet Union, which can only, exclamation point, these are all the exclamation points are in brackets, be reversed by the people itself and its intellectuals, no longer permitted this turn of its own accord, end quote. Yet even in Russian Stalinism, he sees the dialectic of norm and reality fundamentally at work, since, quote, many indications speak for the contact of the great masses, especially students and intellectuals, with the critical and humanist theories of Marxism, having awakened an oppositional and anti-bureaucratic consciousness which, if even only to be hoped for in the long term, must end in a democratic explosion and socialist democratization of the East, end quote. Kofler's position on de-Stalinization exhibits distinct ambiguities at this point. Kofler gives no definite account about how, i.e. in which way, the state socialist bureaucracy will disappear. Kofler's partiality for reform communist currents and his insistence on a dynamic contradiction of norm and reality immediately suggest an evolutionary process from above. Kofler's argument, by contrast, that precisely such a revolution, fed by the contradiction between norm and reality, amounted to a new revolution in thought, and would displace and dissolve the bureaucratic stratum, emphasizes the revolutionary character and is a markedly left communist slant. It was these theoretical ambiguities and latent contradictions, reflections of a historically open situation, in which shifts in position in later years can be found in Kofler. C. Renovations. Kofler returns repeatedly to the topic of Stalinism after 1952, but only in passing, especially whenever new movement and new debates arose on the political left. In the middle of the 1950s, with the emergence of the non-aligned states, the breakup of actually existing socialist relations, and the social democratic path to Bad Godesberg, for example, a consequential restructuring debate, largely repressed today, also happened on the West German left. Khrushchev's, quote, secret, end quote, speech at the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956, in particular, posed the question of the dynamics and perspectives of the increasingly widespread de-Stalinization. In the Andere Zeitung, the, quote, central organ, end quote, of the first generation of the, quote, new left, end quote, radical Democrats, socialists, and communists discussed these questions. Kofler actively intervened with his anti-Stalinist reform communism in these discussions, and radicalized himself when he recognized that after the suppression of the uprising in Hungary and Poland, a lasting re-Stalinization was also coming in Western leftist thought. He thus criticized, for example, the, quote, orthodox clericalism, end quote, of an author of the Andere Zeitung in sharp and decidedly current tones, According to Kofler, the, quote, reactionary orthodoxy, end quote, could be recognized after the 20th Party Congress by the fact that the author placed Stalinism and the Stalinist bureaucracy in quotation marks, thereby blatantly justifying their crimes with, yes, all the important figures of history were likewise criminals, and polemicized against allegedly bourgeois humanism. With all due sharpness, Kofler polemically responded, quote, there is no question whether Stalinism with its methods has done more good or harm to Russia and international socialism, whether or not a way without shameful show trials with inhuman self-accusations, without the murder of renowned Bolsheviks, without the degradation of Marxist science and the arts into a farce, without bureaucratic insanity, and without Stalinist narrowness, even if a more deft and milder way, would have been possible. Instead, the cold-blooded answer is given. They were all thus, therefore, exclamation point. Does the author of this thesis know that without Stalinism, we would have had a socialist country or countries in the West long ago, namely where there were socialism as a result of mature economic conditions. Where socialism, as a result of more mature economic conditions, would have allowed experimentation with vastly more ease, and where even reformism itself could not have prevented it, if Stalinism and Stalinism's satellites had left behind anything other than a disappointing impression to the nations. He considers this question, despite his so self-confident appeal to his concreteness, that has degenerated into an empty phrase, with not a word, end quote. Kofler. Against the, quote, orthodox platitudes, end quote, Kofler polemicized that Stalin's terror, as well as, quote, Ulbricht, we're referring to Walter Ulbricht, the head of the GDR, East Germany, Ulbricht's method of demoralizing the masses of supporters for the SED and pushing them down into the anti-socialist opposition with a methodical stamina that no capitalist opponent would have ever imagined, end quote, was not to be explained rationally with reference to the allegedly colossal tasks. We instead are dealing here with, quote, phenomenon of socialist suicide, end quote. Quote, only the modern unorthodox and truly Marxist humanist, quote, only the modern unorthodox and truly Marxist humanism, understood, end bracket, that consciousness is an element of practice, and had the strength, to work from the ground up revolutionarily on the consciousness of man, to awaken man, precisely due to its rational rigor and consistency, the belief in the future, to teach him to be deeply steeped in the dreaming of the truth of a higher and freer future order, as Lenin demanded, only when this caricature has disappeared, i.e., has been overcome through the, quote, third way, end quote, beyond capitalism and Stalinism, only then will the ideological reflection of Stalinism, reactionary orthodoxy, disperse into nothing, end quote. Kofler. In 1965, with the first tender sprouts of a renewed left-wing formation, Kofler returned anew to the question of the significance of the socialist bloc for Marxists. He warned the young student left that an exact analysis of Stalinism proved that, quote, a humanist regime would have shown at least the same economic success with, at the same time, vastly greater political and cultural and educational successes at home and abroad. Stalinism has set back the international development of socialism half a century, end quote. In the same text, he highlights as positive that the dismantling of Stalinism achieved up to that point, quote, has resulted in a considerable strengthening of the left currents in Italy, France, and England, end quote, while, quote, its relative further existence in East Germany conversely represents a strong impediment for the everyday primitive and passive class consciousness in the proletarian masses, documented many times in the literature, changing ... into an active one, end quote. The, quote, success or failure of humanist democratization of the Eastern countries, end quote, depended ultimately on, quote, whether a decisive historical step forward in the bourgeois countries is achieved, end quote. Another 2 years later, in 1967, Kofler analyzed Maoism in an article incorporated into the Stalinism book of 1970, From Stalin to Mao Zedong. Kofler did not fall for the anti-bureaucratic habitus of Maoism. Kofler sensitively registered the bureaucratic Puritanism becoming apparent in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, quote, which compels the masses entirely following the bourgeois model to asceticism and sacrifice, end quote, and characterizes it as an, even if mild, quote, act of cultural revolutionary, end quote, re-Stalinization of China, end quote. That actually seems like a very, well, not actually, that sounds like I was like, everything he's saying is stupid or something like that, but no, that seems like from my opinion, it seems like a very snappy characterization and accurate characterization of the so-called Chinese proletarian cultural revolution. Quote, the form of this act is certainly more impressive and makes use of the, quote, democratic, end quote, plebiscite of the skillfully called upon youth. But what is obviously repeated is the anti-bureaucratic argumentation on a totally bureaucratic basis. It also repeats the effect of de-intellectualization, bracket, Entgeistung, end bracket. The canonization of the writings of Stalin and the writings of Mao Zedong as sacrosanct guidelines for all other judgments in politics, art, and science, under the intrusively propagated slogan of creativity, quote, creative Marxism, end quote, under Stalin. It repeats under the slogan of the struggle against dogmatism, the total dogmatization of socialist theory, end quote. You'll have to do some research on that. These are pretty solid observations, I think, especially on China. Finally, in 1970, in the topical foreword to Stalinismus und Bürokratie, Kofler servidly defended the ousted Czechoslovakian reformer Alexander Dubček, since all the accusations against Dubček were, quote, consistently slanders, end quote. Once again, Kofler sees Eastern communism, quote, bracket, moving, end bracket, towards one of its nadirs that repeatedly interrupt its path to de-Stalinization, end quote. Yet Kofler somewhat alters his emphasis when he indicates directly afterwards that despite the suppression of the Prague Spring, much has changed in the meantime. The Prague Spring in particular had proved that the historical process of de-Stalinization, to be understood as the, quote, replacing of terrorism with a democratic dictatorship, ... is unstoppable, end quote. It would, above all, have confirmed that this de-Stalinization, quote, was led from above, i.e., without a revolution from below, which was held in many circles to be the only path to the democratization of the Soviet Union, end quote. It would also, however, have confirmed, quote, the fact of the the fact of the emergence of a market as central to the turnover of the commodity economy on the base of the planned economy, pointed to many years later by ignorant critics as a convergence with capitalism, end quote. For the first time in 20 years, Kofler here opposes a revolutionary de-Stalinization from below and stands up for an evolutionary de-Stalinization from above. A conception that he had last formulated in the 1940s in his first two works, but which he had not advanced since his practical experience with, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote. D. Collapse. Differently, therefore, from, for example, Isaac Deutscher or Georg Lukács, the far more radical Leo Kofler before 1968 in his theoretical foundations and practical consequences appears after 1968 to evolve to the, quote, right, end quote, that is, towards those ruling in the Eastern Bloc states. This shift in position, however, only became apparent in the 1980s as a result of his political and personal disappointment in the fate of the New Left and a changed global political situation. The ascension of Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain in 1979 and Ronald Reagan in the USA. I think it says 1989, but that shouldn't say that. I believe that's 1979. I believe Reagan was elected in 1979. Coming into office in 1980, but I'm not sure. Can't remember. Marked the global political transition to both the so-called Second Cold War and to neoliberalism. In its wake, Kofler was early to register the resurgence of a radical social Darwinist, quote, Manchester liberalism, end quote, after the end of history. Quote, post-histoire. I don't know what it looks like it says, quote, Posthistoire, end quote. However, Kofler no longer saw a left response to it. Kofler had drawn the strategic consequence from the failed de-Stalinization at the end of the 1950s that a new, quote, progressive elite, end quote, was needed, reflected in the rise of the New Left, in order to dissolve the deadlocked world historical situation of a, quote, ghost of the revolution which never happened over here, bracket, end bracket, ghost of the revolution which was never completed over there, end quote, theoretically as well as practically. Accordingly, Kofler had detected the spirit of revolt early on and was all the more disappointed Accordingly, he had detected the spirit of revolt early on and was all the more disappointed as this markedly, quote, decomposed, end quote, Peter Bruckner, in parentheses, itself after 1969. After the obvious disintegration of the New Left at the end of the 1970s, and its transition to the new social movements and the Green Alternative Party, Kofler saw this new left, which he had justified historically and philosophically, ultimately pass over into irrationalism and sectarianism. His historico-political view also shifted. One second. However, to quote, his historico-political view also shifted, however, to, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote. If Kofler had previously always emphasized the character of the inadequately de-Stalinized Eastern Bloc as an obstruction to emancipatory thought and action, and the forces of historical progress, he now saw this force of progress only in the East and adopted the Stalinist theory of camps in terms of a theory of the new form of class struggle. Kofler saw the world split anew into two internationals, quote, who however, no longer faced one another as two hostile brothers, but rather are clearly split in a recently founded capitalist international here and in a socialist one there, end quote. Kofler. The industrial world was divided, according to Kofler, in radical antagonism, quote, according to the markedly class struggle perspectives, end quote, with the consequence that the Soviet Union-led, quote, socialist bloc as a bloc put socialist interests in the place of national interests and, so to speak, made the socialist common interest into its political domain, end quote. End quote. Kofler did not hold domestic conditions in the USSR responsible for this lasting change in perspective, but rather the new global political conditions. The political situation of the Second Cold War was quite comparable to the First Cold War in the 1950s. Kofler's answer, however, was not. If Kofler had then belonged to the sharpest critics of Stalinism on the left, now the apologetic tendencies were overwhelming. Though Kofler continued to criticize the historical crimes of Stalinism, Kofler exonerated and excused the Stalinist system. In his 1986 work, Aufbruch in der Sowjetunion, von Stalin zu Gorbatschow, bracket, Awakening in the Soviet Union, question mark, from Stalin to Gorbachev, end bracket. Kofler adapted his old essay on the essence and role of the Stalinist bureaucracy, albeit framed with newer articles that spoke a markedly different language. The bureaucracy no longer stands as a ruling anti-Marxist stratum in the center of the analysis of Stalinism. Kofler now regarded the, quote, main problem of the construction of socialism, end quote, to be its, quote, entrance into the stage of primitive accumulation, end quote. From this perspective, it is consistent to assume that with the obvious end of this primitive accumulation, historical Stalinism had also lost its virulence. Kofler associates the phase of primitive accumulation with the transitional society, and this with, quote, what Marx understood under the stage of socialism in contrast to that of subsequent communism, end quote, and recognizes in the USSR of the 1980s, quote, substantial tendencies of loosening up, though without being able to speak of a final overcoming of the Stalinoid remnants, end quote. Check out the articles on the channel from Paresh Chattopadhyay and Adam Buick on the for critiques of the notion of the transitional society and also of the critique of the concept of socialism and communism being distinct concepts in Marx. Also check out the work, I don't know if I have any on his channel, but check out the work of Peter Hudis. The Stalinoid remnants here, however, signify nothing other than that the social foundations of an organic development towards socialism and communism have been laid, and that it comes down to consciousness alone to develop them accordingly. In, quote, the question of the de-dogmatization and humanization of the socialist ideology, in some quarters decisive steps have already been taken, end quote. That is, for Kofler, under Gorbachev as an educated, quote, charismatic personality, end quote, committed to humanism, so that, quote, the process in this direction when looked at in the long term is unstoppable, end quote. In this manner, the incremental turning away from Stalinism, bracket, becomes, end bracket, likewise, a major step on the path of the construction of a new ... social order. Gorbachevism provides a reliable guarantee for it, end quote. Just as Kofler recognizes the essence of socialism, quote, chiefly and precisely as the consequence of a properly wielded planned economy, ... in seeing through the secrets in which capitalist reification expresses itself, end quote. Kofler's anti-Stalinism reduces itself completely into an enlightened educational dictatorship from above because, quote, extremely alienated people are not at all capable of the true use of their democratic rights, end quote. Socialism and communism here is for Kofler no self-acting free association, AO, of producers, but rather, quote, a clever interplay of the central political control, ... and the extensive autonomy of enterprises and of other institutions, end quote. A comparison with what is depicted above makes clear that this is at best a wicked caricature of Kofler's old critique of Stalinism. Suppressing his words from 1958, Kofler now claims in a typically neo-Stalinist manner that the USSR, quote, due to these certainly inexcusable abuses under Stalinism, does not need to feel ashamed in front of the capitalist countries who with fondness call themselves democratic and free, end quote. After all, their relations under conditions of primitive accumulation were in no way better, end quote. Oh, that's not an end quote. Sorry, I had something came up on the screen. I thought there was a quote there, but no, there's no quote. That's Jünke speaking. Yet the logic of apology drove Kofler even further. The difficulties that Gorbachev's perestroika in the USSR would run into, he explained at the end of 1989, had to do with the, quote, Asiatic mentality, end quote. Hence, everything would already be better, quote, if the Russian individual, who, owing to a long-lasting historical tradition, is only ready to fulfill his obligations to the public under the Knout, K-N-O-U-T, had not used the freedoms granted to him under Gorbachev for sabotage, end quote. That he himself earlier thought and argued differently becomes clear in his 1952 pamphlet, The Case of Lukács, where Kofler writes, quote, it was thus not so much as many claim, quote, the Russian Asiatic tradition, end quote, and the influence of the, quote, Asiatic Stalin, end quote, that are at fault for the peculiar structure of Russian Bolshevism, but rather a good deal more the depicted aspects that also threatened a future European socialism. If the engagement of the democratic assistance of the people and the deepening of socialist theories do not put it on the right track, end quote. Kofler. At the beginning of 1990, he called for the, quote, democratic elections, bracket, in the still existing GDR, end bracket, based on the model of bourgeois. I don't know if I said that right. At the beginning of 1990, Kofler called the, quote, democratic elections, bracket, in the still existing GDR, end bracket, based on the model of bourgeois formal conceptions, problematic, end quote, since they, quote, could lead to historical disaster, end quote. Such thought is a break not only with his own earlier critique of Stalinism, but also a break with that understanding of freedom for which Kofler was a lifelong advocate. Thus, for example, in a programmatic article of 1951, quote, on freedom, end quote, that begins with the words, quote, "We shouldn't fool ourselves. There is no social freedom without freedom for the individual who strives for self-determination and independence, and who, as long as there is human history, has understood, understands, and will understand by freedom the greatest possible freedom from all barriers and bonds," end quote. Kofler. Footnote. That's from On Freedom, the essay by Kofler. End footnote. This turn of the late Leo Kofler may only be understood biographically against the backdrop of his disappointment in that, quote, progressive elite, end quote, who Kofler saw as a backbone of his historico-philosophical theory of a transitional historical epoch, who did not, however, meet his expectations. Yet what does this mean for his theory of Stalinism? Measurements beyond Kofler. Kofler's critique of Stalinism as a critique of bureaucratic ideology is in itself consistent and belongs in its systematization to the best that the Marxist left contributed to the critique of Stalinism. It shows in detail how Stalinist, quote, Marxism, end quote, is a fundamental and sustained falsification of Marxist theory. Kofler manages to reveal a theoretical grammar of pseudo-socialist Stalinoid thought, undialectical, mechanistic, anti-humanist, and anti-emancipatory, that is in the position to approach the posthumous survival of Stalinism. Kofler manages it not least because he understood that the consciousness of an active person is enrolled in an active fact-creating role, and because he understood that Stalinism was also more than only a specific Russian derailment, and that this, to a far greater degree, drew its dynamic from the objective problems of each and every transition to planned economy socialism. So in this sense, Kofler's theory of Stalinism is a radical critique of the bureaucratism of every educational dictatorship that retains its currency until the historic moment in which the free association, of producers and consumers, if it can ever be one, has cultivated self-sustaining institutions and human beings. Yet it is precisely here that a central lacuna, not the only one in his criticism, which Kofler never really reflected on, becomes clear, since Kofler barely reflected on the question of how these socialist and democratic self-supporting human beings and institutions could establish and stabilize themselves. Kofler's emphasis on consciousness for the process of socialist emancipation carried over from classic Austro-Marxism, while as apt as ever was just the one aspect. It could additionally serve to gloss over this lacuna in political practice with the philosophy of consciousness. Kofler tended to that which Henri Lefebvre had criticized in Hegel, proceeding from the recognition that action has specific laws and that practice is creative. Lefebvre formulated the following against Hegel and his, quote, Hegelianism, end quote. True, Hegel did give action a part to play. Hegel saw the absolute idea as the unity of practice and knowledge, of the creative activity and thought. Mind transcends the immediate, mind modifies the object, transforming and assimilating the object, but Hegel did not elucidate action in itself, inasmuch as it comes up against an object which it cannot cause to disappear more or less, quote, spiritually, end quote. Hegel did not develop Kant's analysis of the specifically practical reason. Hegel determined a concept of action and confused action with the thought of action, end quote. And Henri Lefebvre. This lacuna of political theory and practice that naturally is indebted to a fair degree to the world historically novel conditions of a socialist revolution and its ensuing, quote, socialist, end quote, bureaucratic planned economy led Kofler, who substantially focused on consciousness and reform of consciousness, to position himself in the current of reform communism. If one thereby compares him with other reform communists, not least naturally his guiding star, Georg Lukács, it becomes clear that Kofler, on the left edge of reform communism, far more radically revealed and attacked the systematic character of Stalinism. Despite this, Kofler remained volatile. If Kofler began in the 1940s with an evolutionary de-Stalinization from above, in the 1950s he emphasized antagonistic de-Stalinization from below, and fell back in the 1980s to the position he advocated in the 1940s, with the obvious implosion of actually existing socialism at the end of the 1980s, took on marked features of the educational dictatorship. However, the conceptually central emphasis on the reform of consciousness, the hope in an objective dynamic of de-Stalinization mediated through intellectual contestation, not only characterized Kofler. Rather, it was central to the whole of reform communism and hegemonic in the anti-Stalinist left in the 20th century, even in the Trotskyist camp. Through his prominent emphasis on the role of correct consciousness for emancipatory transformations, Kofler gave particularly incisive expression to this hope. If reform communism in general already suffered from the inability to show the institutional foundations and paths of a socialist democratization, this applied all the more to the Austro-Marxist Kofler. One second. Deeply influenced by its socialist pedagogy. The liberalization of the markets and the autonomization of the enterprises propagated by Kofler and others were only makeshift solutions, nothing to do with socialist institutions, and became hardly disputed from the historical vantage point, gateways for bourgeois capitalist logic. In this likewise objective as well as subjective dilemma, the hope in leadership, quote, from above, end quote, was always latently present. From today's vantage point, i.e. after the collapse of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, it is clear that the majority of the left, along with Kofler, erred. If the hope of a more or less harmonious de-Stalinization had been deceptive from the beginning, this does not mean that the dialectic of reform and revolution was condemned to impossibility. The reform movements and uprisings, quote, within socialism, end quote, were in any case until the Prague Spring of 1968 demonstrably and explicitly pro-socialist. This was valid even for the Polish Solidarność movement and Soviet perestroika, at least in their beginnings. That leftist hopes of reform had lastingly cooled since the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia may also have to do with Kofler's dialectic of norm and reality, obviously waning within the nominally socialist countries, After the ruling bureaucracy had again proved itself to be unwilling to reform, indeed incapable of reform. Footnote. Boris Kagarlitsky has strikingly described this historical turning point. Quote, "The invasion of Czechoslovakia and the restoration there of the old political and economic system meant the end of the Soviet economic reform and also of hopes for a new wave of liberalization. ... Market socialism had not suffered an economic defeat, only a political one. ... But before new democratic ideas began to spread, there was disappointment at the fate of the reforms, loss of confidence in Leninism, communism, socialism, everything one had so naively believed in during the 1960s. As usually happens, the baby was chucked out with the bath water." End quote. Boris Kagarlitsky. End footnote. The global political changes of the 1970s and 1980s, however, likely just as much play their role as of yet little addressed role. The demise of Western socialism, the disintegration of the New Left, and the loss of Marxist ideology contingent on it, on the one hand, as well as the rise subsequent to this collapse, as well as deepening of it, of social Darwinist neoliberalism in the Second Cold War, on the other hand, led to all potential attempts at breaking out of the Stalinist and post-Stalinist system being isolated, and this under conditions of a profound economic crisis and the intellectual hegemony of the, quote, idol of the market, end quote. Leon Trotsky's much maligned prediction that the new, quote, socialist, end quote, bureaucracy, out of fear for their social position and of those ghosts they would be compelled themselves to awaken if society aspired to reform, would rather seek to close ranks with the international, quote, class enemy, end quote, than cede their power to a renewed council democracy, proved itself more powerful in reality than the common hope of most reform communists and left socialists that such a world historical about-turn would not occur. At least we would be dealing with the social relations of a, quote, declared transition to socialism, end quote, with the objective substance of an allegedly socialized economy, which nevertheless had to inevitably bring about the corresponding subjective consequences. How profound this illusion was historically can be precisely observed where one would have expected a socialist alternative. So, for example, Ernest Mandel's perestroika writings belong to those which, in my estimation, have stood the test of historical practice. I am naturally thinking here primarily of 1989's Beyond Perestroika and 1991's Power and Money. In Beyond Perestroika and Power and Money is found an analysis of the scope and limits, the successes and contradictions of the Soviet reform process, which contributes more to an understanding of the actually existing socialist implosion than most writings of other socialists and Marxists. Not least because Mandel proceeds from the socio-political and material interests of the persons, groups, strata, and classes involved. In rereading them, however, it is striking how the discussion of the perspectives of a revolutionary overcoming of actually existing socialism's reform dilemmas is shielded from the global economic and political context. However, was of central importance to Leon Trotsky for the future of the socialist world revolution. The likelihood of a political anti-bureaucratic revolution, writes Mandel, for example, in his last great work, hinged, quote, on several questions: the depth and explosiveness of the systemic crisis, the extent of the antagonism between the toiling masses, essentially the working class, and the bureaucracy, or its top stratum, the nomenklatura, and the relationship of forces between the major classes and class factions, and the capacity of the nomenklatura for self-reform pointing in the direction of its own suppression, end quote. Mandel. Yet what of the worldwide relationship of forces between the forces of progress and reaction? What of the hegemony of a neoliberalism based on coercion and consensus, so strong at the end of the 1980s, and the notorious weaknesses of Western socialism, as well as that of the liberation nationalism in the countries of the so-called Third World? Against this backdrop, was anti-bureaucratic revolution at all conceivable in a country in which the working class, on whom this transformation depended, had, quote, unlearned, end quote, to act politically independent and class consciously? Certainly, the dialectic of reform from above and revolution from below was also present in the 1980s in the Soviet Union, though it was plainly too weak under the corresponding global political conditions to change the global political course and to be able to successfully take the, quote, mighty leap into the realm of socialist freedom, end quote. As Lucio Coletti wrote at the end of the 1960s, quote, the historical defeat of Stalinism in all Stalinism's forms has only one positive outcome. This historical defeat of Stalinism restores the internationalist theory of Marx and Lenin a sense of truth and actuality. For this theory, the socialist transformation of the world was unthinkable without the determinate contribution of revolution in the West, that is, in the heart of capitalism itself, end quote. Lucio Coletti. Quote, we have to admit, end quote, writes Mandel in the introduction to Power and Money, quote, that revolutionary Marxists seriously underestimated the disastrous long-term effects of Stalinism and bureaucratic dictatorship on the average level of consciousness, end quote. I don't know what revolutionary Marxist he's referring to. But anyway. The disastrous long-term effects, these are exactly those subjective consequences of a decades-long educational dictatorship congealing into a new objectivity that systematically destroyed and impeded that which actually matters to socialists. Quote, the transformation in the consciousness and organizational level of the international proletariat, end quote. Footnote, quote, the most important criterion of politics for us is not the transformation of property in this or that piece of territory, or as it were the mere development of or as it were the mere development of productive forces. Christoph Jünke, end bracket. As important as it ever may be in and of itself, but rather the transformation in the consciousness and organizational level of the international proletariat and the increasing of their capability to defend old achievements and make new ones. Under this decisive aspect alone and seen as a whole, Moscow's policy is, now as before, reactionary and remains the main obstacle on the path to international revolution, end quote. Leon Trotsky. End footnote. This concerns not least precisely the socialists and communists beyond the borders of the Eastern Bloc, who attempted to compensate for their socio-political powerlessness with dependence on the enlightened absolutism of the, quote, Big Brother, end quote. Already in 1935, actually, I'm going to take a break. Break time. Come on, you son of a gun. Already in 1935, Trotsky had written his work, The Revolution Betrayed. Quote, as a conscious political force, the bureaucracy has betrayed the revolution, but a victorious revolution is fortunately not only a program and a banner, not only political institutions, but also a system of social relations. To betray it is not enough. You have to overthrow it. The October Revolution has been betrayed by the ruling stratum, but not yet overthrown, end quote. A year later, Trotsky came back to this, quote, if the proletariat drives off the Soviet bureaucracy in time, it will still find the nationalized means of production and the basic elements of the planned economy after its victory. That means that it does not need to begin again from scratch. Only radical snobs who are accustomed to hopping carefree from branch to branch can frivolously ignore this advantage. The socialist revolution is too great and difficult a task that one can frivolously do without its invaluable material achievements and begin again anew, end quote. At the end of 1939, Trotsky explained what he meant by this, quote, if a nervous mechanic inspected a car in which, let us say, gangsters had fled on poor roads from police pursuit, and determines that the body is dented, the wheels are buried, and the motor is partly damaged, he is fully justified in saying, quote, this is not a car, this is a devil knows what, end quote. A definition of this kind has no technical or scientific character, but expresses the justified indignation of the mechanic at the work of the gangsters. Let us now imagine that the same mechanic were forced to repair the thing he just called, quote, a devil knows what, end quote. In this case, the mechanic would indeed have to proceed from the recognition that he has a demolished car in front of him. The mechanic would have to determine which parts are damaged and which are whole in order to be able to decide where he should begin with the work. A responsibility-minded worker should relate similarly to the USSR. He is completely justified to say that the gangsters of the bureaucracy have changed the workers' state into, quote, devil knows what, end quote. But if he passes over from this outburst of indignation to solve the political problem, then he must concede that he has a demolished workers' state in front of him, whose economic motor is admittedly damaged, but can continue to work and be completely restored if one switches out some parts. This is obviously nothing more than a comparison, nevertheless it's worth thinking about, end quote. Trotsky. Not least owing to the decades-long destruction of socialist class consciousness through historical Stalinism and Stalinism in theory and politics, there were simply no longer enough technicians and responsibly minded workers to handle this colossal work in the 1980s. At least since then, it should have been clear to the socialist left that in fact it had to be about a real, quote, new beginning, end quote. Unfortunately, however, this is hardly the case. With the final collapse of reform communist hopes and the epochal rupture of 1989 to 91, a large part of this left turned away from socialism in frustration and towards the bourgeois West and its promise of freedom. Another part paid for its refusal to do likewise by turning to cynicism and or new forms of sectarian existence and thought. Another, in turn, surrendered itself to a neo-Stalinism, only hidden with difficulty, the core of which consisted of the sometimes more, sometimes less open defense of historical Stalinism and/or its nature of an educational dictatorship. Against this backdrop, Kofler's critique of bureaucratic pseudo-socialist thought in particular gains relevance, even if directed against himself. Moreover, precisely because Stalinism is more than a historical occurrence, because Stalinism expresses a political thought that certainly need not have to do with the specific national conditions of a Soviet Russia during the 1920s, because it signifies a specific methodology of political theory and practice that always becomes virulent if processes of emancipation and transformation are to go beyond the ruling capitalism. Because of all this, we won't be rid of it too quickly. Only after the illusions have collapsed that Stalinism was merely a historical degeneration, which, do not misunderstand me, it certainly also was, but not only, will it become evident that the best analysts of Stalinism not unjustly referred to the clearest parallels, brought Stalinist thought and action into relation with the thought and action of people in the bureaucratic labor organizations in the bourgeois capitalist form of society. Compare not least Ernest Mandel's comprehensively developed theory of the labor bureaucracy in his last book, Power and Money. Leo Kofler has also had a specific intuition for this when he emphasized that it was impossible to make the specifically vulgar Marxist and mechanistic mode of thought of Stalinism comprehensible from the, quote, material interest, end quote, of these people alone. See above. In a quiet moment, Kofler carried this thought further. As he worked in the first half of the 1960s on the volume Der proletarische Bürger, the proletarian citizen, which encapsulated his socio-psychological studies of neo-capitalist society, Kofler developed once again his original theory of education as the theory of three-class ideologies. Footnote. In German, Bürger can mean bourgeois, citizen, or Bürger, etc. The wordplay in Leo Kofler's title indicates his discussion of the Bürger as a participant in civil society taking on features of the proletarian, who in turn takes on features of the Bürger. End footnote. In the all-around alienated consciousness there were, loosely speaking, three levels of knowledge: the proletarian, the bourgeois, and as the third, the dialectical Marxist level, abolishing both. If bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie had the illusion of a subjective freedom independent of active practice and therefore oriented themselves primarily to subjective education in order to redeem themselves, education for the contemporary dependent workers was, quote, nothing other than a practical tool. He troubled himself about it only as far and only in those times that he was able to practically and politically exploit it, and he turned resignedly away in times of the failure of his movement or of historical stalemate. End quote. Kofler. If the educational aspirations of the bourgeoisie distinguished itself through a contemplative and freer attitude, the modern proletarian consciousness was more reified and oriented towards a narrow practicality. Although exactly because of this it boasted an element of truth, precisely because it acknowledged no fundamental difference between being and thought and faced the ideological heaven of the capitalist world with strong distrust. If one compared these two levels of knowledge and education and placed them in relation to the third, to the Marxist, quote, self-knowledge of the identical subject-object and its processual positing through this self-knowledge, end quote, the formal closeness of the first, the proletarian level, to the third, the Marxist, is apparent, since dialectical thought is as something scientific and philosophical, a non-contemplative one, quote, an aspect of the essence of the practical process itself, a reasoning of reality, end quote. Quote, perhaps it was exactly the vulgar misinterpretation, end quote. Kofler is referring here to that vulgar materialist mode of thought that consistently struck a chord with the proletariat, quote, which at the same time presented something like a popular version of Marxism, through which the thinking worker could get an understanding of this theory, just as it probably conversely contributed much to the in itself reified proletarian mode of thought, lending it a vulgar materialist appearance, end quote. Here, a look at Stalinism suggests that its vulgar material thought in East and West derives less from the not overcome remnants of bourgeois ideology, as Kofler and many other Marxists suggested in their critique of Stalinism, but more from the specifically proletarian situation of the workers, from their theory and practice. Considered in this way, Kofler's emphasis on a necessarily transformed ideology in the process of de-Stalinization loses its limitation as an ideological critique, and thereby also its illusions related to ideological critique. and constitutes itself much more strongly as an emphasis on radical change in the practical proletarian situation, and thus refers back less to questions of ideological education of the proletarian class than to questions of economic and political forms of work, organization, and life, that is, to political and social practice! Exclamation point. In this way, it opens a provocatively fresh perspective on Stalinist vulgar materialism as an expression also of a proletarianly reified, i.e., half-emancipated consciousness, a conformism cloaked in nonconformism, which under certain historical and sociological conditions forms a backbone of labor bureaucratic, quote, degeneration, end quote, and shines another interesting light on Trotsky's theory of politbureaucratic socialism as, quote, degenerated worker states, end quote. Thanks for listening.